So Futuresteading is essentially all the activities that go towards living like tomorrow matters, and it's really steeped in the Iroquois Indian approach of looking 7 generations in front in the way in which you make decisions and leaning on the knowledge of the 7 generations before in order to ensure that you have a long-term and holistic understanding of what your role in the world is. It's really a paradigm. It's really a mindset.
You're listening to the Good Dirt Podcast. This is a place where we dig into the nitty-gritty of sustainable living through food, fashion, and lifestyle.
And we're your hosts, Emma and Mary Kingsley, the mother-daughter founder team of Lady Farmer. We're sowing seeds of slow living through our community platform, events, and online marketplace.
We started this podcast as a means to share the wealth of information and quality conversations that we're having in our world as we dream up and deliver ways for each of us to live into the new paradigm, one that is regenerative, balanced, and whole.
We want to put the microphone in front of the voices that need to be heard the most right now: the farmers, the dreamers, the designers, and the doers.
So come cultivate a better world with us. We're so glad you're here. Now, let's dig in. Welcome, everyone, to The Good Dirt, and for many of you, welcome to the end of our first week of the Slow Living Challenge, during which we've been focusing on the theme of nature, which is a pretty big topic, but if you've been around here for a while, you know it is a key element of what we talk about and the work that we do. Our online community membership is Slow Living Through the Seasons, because we've learned that a key part of slowing down and living more simply and sustainably is to rediscover our connection to nature. So this week we've had several prompts and activities for you to choose from, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Emma, which of these prompts has resonated with you this week?
Well, just to fill anyone in who is not yet following along, this week we talked about spending at least 20 minutes outside, even if it's not perfect, ideal outside weather, identifying flora and fauna around you, bring the outside in, journaling, meditating, watching for wildlife. So I do go on a walk pretty much every day. I'm more apt to skip days when the weather isn't ideal. But this week, there's been a couple of days when I've said, you know what? Just because I don't think that the weather is ideal, it's not like actively downpour. So I'm going to walk. And when I do that, even though this happens every time, it's easy to just forget. It's actually so lovely. And there's less people out and about. There's less traffic on the trail. There's more to observe. It's a little quieter. And I really love that. And the place where I sit and journal in my house, I can actually open a door right near it that kind of opens to the back. And it's been warm enough a couple of days where I can sit and journal with the door open. So I'm like right to the outside. And that's been a fun little adjustment to my journaling practice. So what about you?
Yeah, well, something I've been observing this week with great delight and pleasure is on my daily walk, there's a pond that I walk around, and I just have been thinking about how the surface of that pond has changed so dynamically, even in recent weeks. So all summer long, the surface is just covered with lily pads, and it's so beautiful, and they bloom, and it's just like this bowl of beautiful flowers. And then when the frost comes, they brown up, and then eventually they disappear. And then in December, when we had that big freeze, the pond was covered with ice. So that had a completely different look. So beautiful. And, the birds flying around it and landing on it, the light reflecting on the ice. Now that we've had a thaw or two during the last few weeks, the ice is gone, but it's just a beautiful, still surface now with nothing on it, no plants, no ice. And so just observing the changes in the surface of the pond has been delightful to me this week.
Yes, that sounds really delightful. I love that little pond that you're talking about. And it is really fun to have something like that on your walk, a fixture like that you can really observe. So you can join the Slow Living Challenge at any time. Some of you may already have been going along with the prompts day by day, and some of you may have signed up, but you haven't been engaging with any of the prompts. That's okay. even if you haven't signed up at all. The link is in our show notes. Even if you sign up and you don't engage with anything and you don't experience anything, even just reading some of the words that we are sharing and that others are sharing through their experiences will definitely make you think. And we'd love to hear your thoughts about slowing down. So yeah, visit the link in our show notes. Also, if you follow us on Instagram, we are Lady Farmer. We make everything really accessible and available there. And we can't wait to see what you've got going on.
Yes, we look forward to seeing your experience, reading about it. Yeah. You'll get a list of several of our past podcast episodes that have a lot of great discussion about this theme of nature, such as one of our guests who spent an entire year in the wild by herself. Some of you might remember that one, Claire Dunn. And another whose work is dedicated to creating an ecological civilization, which is a future civilization where humanity and all of creation live in balance and justice for all living things. That's Andrew Schwartz of EcoCiv. So anyway, this takes us right into today's conversation, coming to us all the way from Australia with Jade Miles of Black Barn Farm. Jade is the author of Futuresteading, a practical and inspirational guide to living in a way that values tomorrow. And she's host of a podcast by the same name. Futuresteading is Jade's own term, which is a way of living grounded in a slower, simpler, steadier existence as a first step to building a healthier planet and healthier humans.
In addition, Jade runs Black Barn Farm, a permaculture-based horticultural operation with her husband and their 3 children, inspired by their belief in building a localized, fair food system.
Our conversation with Jade was inspiring and also truly compelling as we heard about the family's personal experience during the catastrophic fires in Australia during 2019 and 2020. It's one thing to be hearing all of that in the news and quite another to talk with someone who was there. And it's just amazing to be talking in real time to someone on the other side of the world anyway. We often complain about technology when things don't work, but we're pretty wowed when it does work and we get to have conversations like this.
Definitely. So we know you'll love this one. Here's Jade Miles speaking with us from her home in Australia, Black Barn Farm in Stanley, Victoria.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be talking across continents and across time zones and without having to experience any jet lag. So that's always pretty special. My name is Jade Miles, and I'm a futuresteader, which is a completely made up word, but it sort of leans in on permaculture and homesteading. I am a podcaster. I'm an author, both with the name Futuresteading, but I'm also a mum of 3, and I'm the CEO of a business called Sustainable Table. I guess if I was to explain my identity, it would be to say that I'm someone who is really connected to the natural world and the rhythms and the cycles that come with that, the good, the bad, the ugly, the hot, the cold. I do everything that I can to build community skills towards a more indigenised and more resilient community and future. And we're in northeast Victoria in a place called Beechworth. Well, actually, we're on a plateau, the Stanley Plateau, which is very near a little town called Beechworth, which is an old gold mining town in Australia, which is a temperate climate. Actually, Tuesday was snowing, and today it's going to be about 28 degrees Celsius. We're all outside in blazing sunshine with big hats and sunblock and old op shop shirts. You call them, what do you call them? Thrift store shirts. So we're at that real crux of the season that ebbs and flows.
Yeah, it's similar here, but opposite. That's so funny.
Well, we're right in the middle of spring, almost at summer.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So, we know this. We know that the Southern Hemisphere is opposite. It's not what we're oriented to, obviously. So, and here we are talking. It just seems like such an amazing thing. Yeah. So yeah, we're moving into the hibernation season. So tell us a little bit about, your background
and what path you took to get here. Maybe was there an aha moment when your life kind of shifted direction to lead you where you are today at Black Barn Farm?
Yeah, I think I was a really lucky kid to grow up in an environment that had no money. We had absolutely nothing at all, but I had a huge family around me, not my immediate family. I'm only one of 4 siblings, but I had all of my aunties and uncles around me, and we grew up in a small village community where our sense of obligation to one another was pretty strong, and it was inbuilt into the way we existed, and we sort of rolled out our family values. It was a really healthy environmental climate in that we had 4 very distinctive seasons, and we were able to grow our own food, and we were fortunate enough to live on a little bit of land where we could have our own animals. And my dad was an artist, quite abstract and a little bit eccentric. He's an artist, he's still alive, not very well, but still alive. And my mother was a nurse, and so her sense of service was a really strong, dominant part of our childhood. We had a very solid understanding of every individual's role in providing service to their community. And my dad, while he was more narcissistic than that, she's ultimately very selfless, and he's ultimately quite selfish. But the lessons that he taught us were different. They were steeped in truth and brutal honesty and respect for your elders and sort of a reverence for the community that you belonged to and the role that you needed to play in sort of contributing to that through really where people had all come from. Empathy, I suppose. He taught us empathy from a really early age, but he himself was actually very hard, really hard. And we also spent a lot of time living in fairly remote locations. My dad painted, and so he would go away and paint for months on end in far-flung locations, and we would go with him and just bang around the campsite and sort of unschool, I guess. And so my brother and I both had the opportunity to learn pretty young how to be fiercely independent, how to be really interconnected with the seasons. He would often go into the studio and lock all the doors to the house, and he would go into his painting world for hours on end. And so we had little choice but to find ways to feed ourselves through what we could find in the paddocks or foraging or in the veggie garden or in the chook pens. It wasn't unusual for us to eat chicken pellets pretty regularly and make tea out of a fire that we'd light or mussels that we'd find in the creek. So we had a fairly long rope, and that got us into trouble all the time, but it also gave us a really exciting opportunity to be curious and explore the natural world. I did veer towards not corporate. I've never spent time in corporate, but I certainly veered towards sort of glossier, shinier, less hippie or less permy, as my kids would say, ideology in my late teens and early 20s. I worked in the ski industry for quite a while in Australia and then travelled for years and years and years. I did about 6 or 7 years of travel, not back to back, but into really interesting locations around the world where I was involved in setting up lots of different small-scale businesses and learning how to live really creatively, completely on the fly with no money at all. But by the time I was in my late 20s, I had committed to my husband. We'd been together for a long time but travelled separately. And Charlie and I knew that we wanted to farm. We needed more than we'd founded a food co-op, and we'd really understood or begun to learn what local food systems meant to our ability to steward land. And so we started to research what that looked like. We had our children, well, I say relatively young. It's probably not very young. I was 29, but none of our friends were having kids at that point, so we were well ahead of lots of them. And I haven't actually ever had an aha moment because I've had lots of the foraging skills and homesteading skills in my psyche since I was tiny. So there was never an aha moment, but children certainly heightened my need or desire to grow my own food and know where it came from and be deeply connected to place and have them deeply connected to place. And then we had been farming here for probably 5 years or 4.5, 5 years after a 10-year search for the right block of land. And, we'd started the food co-op and we'd built a really strong surrounding regional food system, local food system. And we had been through really extensive fire seasons, and Charlie, who has fought fires for the last 15 or 20 years, was away for the better part of 3 months because Australia in 2019, 2020 was just coming off the back of a drought, and we burnt, the country burnt, the whole of the East Coast and the South Coast and Tasmania burnt for months and months on end. And so even those who weren't directly involved with a partner away or in the firing line, as the case may be, they experienced it because we just had months and months of pretty dramatic and fairly frightening footage on all of our media channels. And also the smell of smoke was pushing into our cities like it never had before. And really for the first time, there was this sense that the country was galvanising towards acknowledging that we all have to change and that something needs to shift. And I think I thought at the time, on maybe the 6th or 7th week of Charlie doing 14 and 15-hour days away from the farm and me managing the farm on my own with heightened kids and fairly high levels of stress, that I can't let this be just another season. There was this sort of narrative that was evolving in mainstream media that we needed to change something, but then subtly it shifted, and the galvanised sense of all of us coming together, which I'd found quite exciting, was suddenly pointing its finger at our politicians and saying they need to fix this. And I was standing in my chook and I'd just said goodbye to him for a night shift on the fire trucks, and I remember thinking, they don't have to fix anything. I don't even know who the hell they are. They're our government, but they are bureaucratic and they are slow moving because that's what democracy does. And they actually can't bring about the change that we as individuals can. We need to reckon with the reality that we're facing. We need to take agency in our own lives, and we need to find a way of making sure that our communities are built on skill and are built on trust and are built on honesty and are built on an open willingness to be vulnerable. And all of that is the individual's responsibility. That is not what the government can control. It's culture, and we need to rebuild culture. And so at that point, I decided to start the podcast, and I decided to really galvanise the shared learning experiences that we'd put on the ground through workshops and schools programs here at the farm, and write a book and capture some of those skills. And really that was probably the most aha moment that I could have had. The only other one would be when I realised that we lived on a plateau that had once had 35 small-scale family-owned farmers on it, and that now there were only 3 still in existence because everybody else had been pushed out because small-scale family-owned farming is not viable here unless you can create a short, supply chain so that your path to market is direct to the consumer. And, generation after generation of farms were being pushed out all around us, and we were heartbroken by it, and it made us really start to question what our food system looked like. That was a long-winded response, wasn't it?
All so great. Thank you.
I know. That was wonderful. And I'm loving this. I'm like at the edge of my seat. So the big fire, what you describe is kind of a turning point in your approach and your perspective. That was, did you say 2018 or 19? I mean, I remember it being in the news.
It was at the end of our 2019, start of our 2020. So we'd just come off the better part of a decade of drought in our country and went straight into fires, a summer from hell, really. And then just as they were wrapping up, COVID locked us down.
So 2019 was this big fire, and I can say that over here on the other side of the world, we were, hearing about it and aware of it, and it actually felt, even for us so far away, it felt kind of apocalyptic. It was like, this is like,
it really was.
Is this really happening? And it didn't, Australia is the other side of the world, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like this is, our home is burning,
And it was even, I remember it was pre-pandemic. It was
Yeah.
like the first of the really apocalyptic feeling events that sort of happened.
Yes.
It was really impactful for all of us.
That's when I started hearing and learning about, the sixth extinction
Yes.
that they talk about, it's happening before our eyes. And so what was that like to be like right in the middle of it? I mean, you've explained a little bit that, you smelled the smoke and it was scary, but did you just go on with your day? I mean, how? My goodness. I mean, just
We're really used to it because Charlie's been fighting with fires for, nearly 2 decades. And even where we are in our little part of the world, we've experienced 3 major campaign fires per decade for the last 2 of them. So that's pretty. It consistently gets you in the mindset. You understand what summers look like, and you're fire ready. I mean, it wouldn't be unlike living in California. You're critically aware of what could go wrong. Day to day, it's pretty stressful for us because Charlie's away. So we've had little kids that whole time, and so I am managing the kids and trying to keep their concerns and their worries at bay. And, the farm then becomes mine to manage day in, day out because he's just not here. The air is thick with smoke, and so thick, depending on the circumstances. If you're really close to a fire, it comes in and even the daylight can go.
Wow.
So it can feel pretty frightening and pretty unstable and pretty relentless and it definitely feels apocalyptic, and you do wonder whether this is your new reality. It's certainly not the summers of our childhood where we felt carefree and long, beautiful twilight evenings. And my littlest one, my 10-year-old, who's now 11 actually, she was 8 at the time, or 9 when the fires went through. 9 when the fires went through. She hates summer. It makes her really anxious because we know people that have lost their houses. We know people that have lost their lives. We know really just how cruel it can be. And I guess Australia's climate has us on the front foot of understanding how to manage rising temperatures because we've been experiencing it for a lot longer than many other countries. So it feels like the canary in the coal mine. It feels like it's telling us something that we need to listen to, and that, Mother Nature has tolerated the way we've interacted with the natural world for a long time, but now she's stamping her feet and telling us it's time to lift our game as tenants. We need to pay the rent and get on with it.
Yes, it does. The canary in the coal mine. That's a fascinating analogy because, like I said, we were all here just watching this, and there's natural disasters all over the world, especially in recent years. But that one, the Australia fires, was really like, okay, here we are, folks.
Yeah, it was pretty galvanizing.
It was. And so now that, now we're 3 years past that, and we've had the pandemic. And do you feel like that the collective consciousness has sort of lost some of its galvanization around it? Do you think it's kind of worn off, like in America when 9/11 happened, there was this period of time where everybody was together and had this spirit of community and everything, and then it sort of wore off. And now we're all polarized and everything. And then, with the pandemic, there was this kind of appreciation for not so much driving and not so much flying, and we're giving nature a break. And now it's like, oh well, that's all over. Everybody's things are back to normal anyway. So do you have any of that kind of feeling about it?
Definitely. There was, there was a fire in everybody's belly. It didn't matter where you went, everyone was united on the fact that we needed to bring change and we needed to get our politicians to listen and understand. But I think there has definitely been a pretty strong shift in people's collective knowledge or ecological knowledge and people's desire to reconnect with self and reconnect with place and reconnect with community. People's transition is varied, and so some people are moving really quickly and some people are moving much more slowly. But I think and of course people have got back in planes and they're starting to travel again, and that's yesterday's problem, and we've got back to this state of normal, and whatever normal means. But I think even, the IPCC report is now something that people that 10 years ago would never have understood, what its messaging was, and now they do clearly understand that. I think it's hard to know whether or not you're operating in a bell jar and you're talking to like-minded people all the time. And when you start a podcast, you're actively seeking out people that think similarly, and so you're seeking values alignment everywhere you go. And so maybe I'm in an echo chamber because that's what I'm seeking, but I don't feel like those people are as hard to find as they were even 5 years ago or even 3 years ago. I feel like people are now actively, when I put a workshop up on our website, it sells out within a week. Rarely do we have leftover tickets. And so they're all for really basic fundamental things like weaving or women's rewilding circles or wicking bed workshops or grafting workshops or Futuresteading workshops, really basic things. And people are desperate to have this knowledge and build connection. So I feel like there's definitely a shift in the consciousness.
Yeah, I think that we can say similar things about our experience here. That's so exciting about your workshops on the farm, and those all sound so great. I want to go to those.
Yeah, I know.
Can you tell us about farm scale permaculture? I think most listeners of this podcast probably know about permaculture and understand, at least in a broad concept, what it is. But I actually haven't heard of farm scale permaculture. And you talk about scaling up and scaling out. And the main criticism that I hear of permaculture, and that makes sense to me why it would be a criticism, is that it doesn't seem scalable. So I'm wondering what you have to say about that.
Well, permaculture is to create a permanent culture. So when it was first devised, it was really devised as a permanent agriculture, but rapidly it became really abundantly clear that it was about actually shifting our culture towards our capability for creation of permanence. And so really, it's not a farming practice or a food growing practice. It's a framework for decision making. And so when you sit and contemplate the way in which you will make your decision, and this is really sort of my evolution of permaculture has turned into Futuresteading, it is about really assessing whether or not the decision that you make will have an outcome that is regenerative, sustainable, or degenerative. And so when you scale permaculture up, it's really about applying all of the decisions, or it's about applying the framework to all of the decisions that you make right from the ground up. So it's not just the way you're growing food, but it's the way you're interacting with the seasons. It's the way you are interacting with your community. It's the way you are shortening the supply chain and spreading a knowledge of farming vagaries or, farming viability. It's the way you open source body, mind and soul and share any knowledge that you've got with anybody who is interested in learning. It's the way you close the loop on your waste management and the way you interact with your community to access what someone would see as waste, but what you see as a rich resource. It's the way you ensure that your toilets for your public that are visiting the schools programs or the workshops or the farm gate visitors are using composting toilets that then go back into the mulching and composting system that then goes back onto the orchard. It's about looking at where your water comes from and understanding, what your predominant weather patterns are and your weather direction is, and being prepared for all of that, but not just on your block, but for those that are around you as your neighbouring community. And so it's really about taking all of the permaculture principles, of which there are 12, and applying them to the way in which you make your decisions for everything that you do on your property to ensure that it is open source and that it's decolonised and that it's regenerative by nature and that it's deeply connected to seasonality and that it's indigenised where possible. So it's all of those things, which sounds quite complex, but actually it's about stripping back the noise, and it's about realising that, we exist in a world that is intentionally noisy, where the mainstream narrative is fairly strongly dictated by very, very few who are the global powers, because they manage and control all of our media messaging. It's about turning all that off, turning off the radio, turning off Instagram, turning off social media of all sorts, turning off the television, and actually just being really still and really observing and seeking slow solutions and realising that we are human, so things need to be at human scale. We're only on 23 acres here, but, it's zoned. So the whole property is zoned, and we have areas that are sort of workhorse industrial zones that are open paddocks for animals, that are intensively managed as horticulture, that are right at our back door because that's where our kitchen garden is. So we've got all these different zones, and really it's not that we're in a small-scale backyard, a suburban backyard. It's that we've taken permaculture and applied that framework to the way in which we make all our decisions across every component of the farming enterprise.
And what does your enterprise look like? Like, what commercial operations do you have going on? Do you sell meat? Do you sell produce? What does that look like?
So we're ultimately an organic heritage orchard, and so we have about 100 different varieties of apple, and they ripen from January until June, which would be your June until December. And they ripen from the bottom of the hill to the top of the hill. So we opened pick your own rows as the season goes on. And we also have berries. So we've got about 3 kilometres of berries here. So we have berries and apples and pears, and we did have cherries, but we've just pushed those out because they come before our Christmas here, which just extends our time where we are on and open. And so we've just consolidated that a little. And we also have mountain pepper, and we grow that. It's an Indigenous mountain pepper. We grow that intentionally to what we call pay the rent. That allows us to grow an Indigenous bush food, but any money that is made from it goes back to our local Indigenous people. And it allows us to understand, or teach, I should say, not understand, but to teach different school groups or groups that come through why we've intentionally planted that. We haven't sacrificed much space for it. It does give us another crop, but it also allows us to connect more deeply with the local First Nations people.
Tell us about what is a mountain pepper? Sorry, before we go on.
Oh, it's a little. There's only 35 of them out there in the orchard. They are a little tiny pepperberry, and they have male and female plants, and you need both for pollination. They crush down to be a really spicy, aromatic, beautiful, essentially a pepper replacement. But we also we've very intentionally built a business on diversity. So we don't just farm apples, and we don't just run schools workshops, and we don't just run, education upskilling programs, and our kids have we do all of it, and we do all of it intentionally because it then means that if we get hit by frost, which would impact our berries or our apples, and it would impact our ability to open for pick your own, we also have a nursery, and the nursery is grafted up every September and popped in the ground. It's a really small but intensive plot of horticulture, and it means that we've got, regardless of what weather vagaries are thrown at us, we have got an alternative crop that we can sell, and that's the nursery trees that we sell a year later. So we very intentionally embedded diversity, which is a tool of Mother Nature really, into every component of our business. So not only in what we grow, but where it's positioned on the property and the way it's positioned. So all of our rows are planted on contour, which means we don't have any straight rows anywhere on the property. All of the rows follow the flow of the land, which allows us to manage water, to bring water out of the valleys and into the rises. And so we can move water through it. We can ensure that every apple that we have on the property, might be in different locations. So it means that if the top trees or the bottom trees, as the case may be, get hit by frost, we have trees at the top that don't get hit by frost. Or if one area is in a slightly more compact soil area or soil type, then in another area they can thrive. So we replicate diversity in every component of our business, through our path to market, through our planting, through the things that we plant, through the time of year that we harvest, and through the various business arms that we offer.
So where did you learn permaculture? Was it something that you've been cultivating for many, many years, or did you just sort of jump into it? And when you got the farm, tell us about setting all that up.
I grew up with it. My parents were both practicing permaculturists, so I've always understood it fairly intuitively. But it wasn't until I became an adult and decided that we wanted to push sort of not just into food system advocacy, but into the grassroots version of it. We really wanted our hands in the dirt. That my husband and I both went and did a PDC, a permaculture design certificate. He did his quite a few years before me, and then I did mine afterwards. And we both did it with a guy called David Arnold, who works quite closely with David Holmgren, who is the co-founder of permaculture, and a couple of other incredible people that he brings on to the program. And I guess the reason we did it with him was because it was local to our region, and we really wanted to connect with other people that were going through this journey of education and sort of paradigm shift at the same time. And also because he is running a property that has been established for about 20 years, and it's a similar scale to ours, a very different growing climate. He's got a much less or a much lower rainfall than we do. We get about 1,400 mils a year, and he gets about 600 mils a year. But, you know, just the way he had applied his thinking at scale was a really good opportunity for us to understand how we might apply some of those principles to our own development of our own property. And then we've continued to work with other people who are from the permaculture sphere right across Australia, really, just to understand what it looks like in different climates and in different communities.
So that's fascinating. You are really steeped in it, and I love your description of the top-down orchard and why you don't plant in straight rows and all of those things. And also the listeners that might not be super familiar with the principles of permaculture. One of the big ones is what Jade was describing is in diversity. When you diversify your operation, you build in resilience. Like you said, Jade, you know, if you have a bad frost, then you have options. You're not just out of business like you hear all the time. Like, you know, the bad weather, the hailstorm or whatever wiped out a farmer. So there are principles embedded in the permaculture practices that to some extent protect you from that. So I'm very excited to hear about some of the indigenous roots of your region and how that's reflected in the work you're doing. You've mentioned some things, but I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
So this region has a bit of contention that floats around it. I'm on Palang Dang Medang country, and the Palang Dang Medang people are an offshoot of the Pangarang people, or the broader language group of Pangarang. Exactly where we are is quite temperate, but it's subalpine, and so there would never have been a time where this land was occupied all the time. It just gets too cold over winter, and they would have gone south into the riverlands, which aren't very far from here, but significantly warmer. They're lower in altitude and have rich alluvial soils. And so it would have made sense that this was a location that was passed through or utilised in the summer months. We've just started to really address this in our country. I would say that we are pretty new to understanding what this needs to look like. We've gone for a very long time thinking we're doing the right thing as the colonial white men, and in fact all we've done is further damage our potential for reconciliation or relationship building. And the sad truth is that there are great swathes of our country that no longer have Indigenous or First Nations people who have had unbroken connection to their land because they've been moved around and they've had their language taken from them, they've had family systems broken, and, you know, reckoning with that is pretty confronting for those who colonial right through to their roots, of which I am. The organisation that I run has an operating principle of decolonisation, and we take philanthropic money from funders all around the country and soon to be investors at a broader scale and distill that into projects or insert it into projects that are changing food systems. And a lot of the projects that we're encouraging to submit applications to the program are Indigenous led or First Nations led. And these are the sorts of projects that if we can rebuild our agricultural foundations, have the ability to completely change our food system. And so really the kind of work that I'm doing in this space, or my understanding of the work in this space, is more associated with my off-farm work than it is with my on-farm work, because it's contentious as to who actually walked this land. They don't walk it anymore, and there is interrupted culture, and so we don't have those who can claim consistent cultural access or connection to this part of the world. But the pepperberries that we've planted have intentionally been planted to find a way to reconnect with those in our community and to pay the rent.
What is the name of the organization that you lead?
Yeah, it's called Sustainable Table. So it's a national organisation, but and our team are flung all over the country, and the projects that we support are flung all over the country, and our investors or funders are also from all across the country and have slightly different lenses as to why they're participating in some of our programs. But ultimately everybody just wants to see the development or enhancement of a regenerative agricultural system here in Australia.
I see. And what do you see happening across the country as a result of the work of this organization? What kind of events do they have? And can you speak about that?
So we fund projects, and the projects are vast and varied. So it depends on where they are and who's leading them, and what sort of impact area they're aligning with us. But, they're everything from small-scale Indigenous grain trials right through to localized food system expansion into slightly larger areas, or trial product of organic alternative grain crops that are growing in certain areas that would otherwise have been left fallow or left to just monoculture crops. We've also got quite a few First Nations-led projects around rehabilitation and nurserymanship, First Nations projects that are women-led, that are connecting white man culture to black man culture and finding ways to do that through production of food. So really vast and varied. Some of the projects are as small and simple as just securing permanent water for refugee programs to ensure that they can grow food, because, some of our areas are so drought-stricken and so reliant on irrigation water that they've, got no ability to guarantee food production without water, and so having permanent water entitlements gives them the ability to guarantee ongoing production and programming. So really vast and varied, and all across the country and all in different bioregions and across different farming sectors, but all ultimately working towards a regenerative agricultural food system.
Very cool.
Yes.
That's so amazing to hear about.
You guys have Mad Ag in your country, and it's not dissimilar. Mad Ag and Go Steward, and there's some really, even the land trust programs that you guys have got going feel much more sophisticated than some of ours, but we're reliant on philanthropics and impact investors to really shift the needle on this, because it means we can be really nimble and we can be really dynamic, and industry can lead, as opposed to top-down initiatives where government leads.
Well, that's really encouraging to hear. And I definitely want to look up some of those organizations. I didn't know about that before now.
Right.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
So, Jade, you've talked about it a little bit so far, but can you please speak more directly to Futuresteading and what that is, and maybe tell us a bit about your book and your own podcast?
Yeah. So Futuresteading is essentially all the activities that go towards living like tomorrow matters, and it's really steeped in the Iroquois Indian approach of looking 7 generations in front in the way in which you make decisions, and leaning on the knowledge of the 7 generations before in order to ensure that you have a long-term and holistic understanding of what your role in the world is. And so it's really a paradigm. It's really a mindset. It doesn't require you to have land to do it. You could be thinking and operating this way from an apartment in the city. And when I was in the States, actually, earlier in the year, I was over there doing a book tour, and we're all up and down the East Coast, and I was in New Jersey, and someone said, well, I live 4 stories up and I'm in a 1-bedroom apartment and I've got nowhere that I can grow food and there isn't a community garden nearby to me. How do I engage in this way of thinking? And power of the group was able to come together and start to bang a whole different range of amazing ideas around. And by the end of the session with this group on the sidewalk in New Jersey, there were potluck dinners being organised for Sunday evenings. There were keys being swapped between different apartment holders because someone had a balcony that they didn't want to grow food, but someone else didn't have a balcony and they did want to grow food. And someone else had what they termed an illegal, but they'll ask approval or seek forgiveness later rather than ask permission. They had set up a veggie garden on their rooftop and they were willing to share with other community members who didn't have such access to rooftops. All of these amazing sorts of initiatives can spring up really from wherever you live. It's really about opening your mind to the idea that the decisions that you make have an impact on tomorrow. And so we need to ensure that we are thinking beyond sustainable and we're thinking regeneratively in every decision that we make. And so I guess the other thing with it, though, is that it needs to come in a way that is joyful, because as soon as we become dogmatic or puritanical about something, it's really hard to keep others wanting to come on the journey with you, and it's really hard to stick with it ourselves because there is that incredible say-do gap between where we want our ideology to sit and where our daily actions need to sit and where we actually find it comfortable to sit. I've interviewed lots of people in the pod who've said, well, actually, maybe it's time that we are pushed outside of our comfort boundaries, and there's merit in that too, that maybe transition, it needs to be forced and it needs to be pushed and moved a little bit faster, because actually as long as we have the conveniences and the low-cost existence that the vast majority of us rely on for a convenient and comfortable life, then nothing will change. And so maybe we do actually need to push ourselves outside of our comfort zones. But I think ultimately the thing that Futuresteading leans on very heavily is our comfort at being human. We're not machines. We don't need to operate at the pace of machines. We don't need to expect that there will be techno solutions to pull us out of this, but actually we as individuals and our ability to interact with each other as other individuals in a whole sum of the parts will actually result in a much more resilient community that can withstand the knocks that are inevitably coming through the changing climate, rapidly changing climate, as we hurtle towards a place of minimising our finite resources.
Beautiful, yeah. And I love also the alternative term from homesteading, because homesteading is something that I think people understand automatically, and it has a lot of flowery imagery associated with it. But I've actually, my mom and I have talked about this recently, how homesteading really has roots in, it's kind of a dark beginning, because it was really about colonialism and pushing people out of their homes and this manifest destiny sort of idea that I think we should not celebrate but think about differently. So I really like the idea of Futuresteading as in a different word.
Yeah, reframe. Yeah, which is why you see in Australia, homesteading isn't as understood as it is in America. And so its roots are definitely in homesteading, but it's really about creating a steady future. So there's a play on homesteading, but it's really about that.
Yeah. And I think, gosh, that leads us, you said so many things that I feel go right into the next question is, what does slow living mean to you? And I think a lot of what you said is already an answer to that, but I wonder if you'd like to talk about that a little more.
Yeah, and we often ponder this because the other term that gets used a bit is the simple life, and there is truly nothing about this that is simple. There are a lot of moving parts, and it's you're always up against the season because the season dictates just about everything that you're doing. And, there's so much that is out of your control. We've just had weeks and weeks and weeks of endless rain, which has made our spring push really tricky because we're fully backed into a corner because we don't have the ability now to play catch up because the season's going to beat us. It's suddenly going to be hot and we won't have our irrigation in, or we won't have planted the spring plantings, or whatever it might be. But a simple life, which I think is an oxymoron because it doesn't really work in the truest form, or slow living, I think is about pushing back on the white noise. I think the white noise that dominates Western culture shoves endlessly the message of growth down our throats. The idea of endless biggering and endless techno solutions and endless ignoring of the blatant truth that sits in front of us about our existence on a finite planet is what we actually need to push back on. And when you evaporate that noise and you actually make time in your own head to build rituals and to connect with the outside world and to connect with your people and to connect with yourself in a way that is really human, it gives you the ability to build a totally different rhythm and a totally different way in which you interact as one tiny cog in the sum of a much more complex web of existence. And I think that is what slow living looks like. It's where you've actually got the time and the space to respond to what your body needs, to respond to what the soil that you're trying to grow food in needs, to understand where your water comes from, to understand what impact a hotter summer or a colder winter will have, to really contribute to your community because you've eked out enough time to live much more simply and with less stuff, but with more time for the community that will ultimately be your support network when a global existence is no longer possible. So slow living to me is quiet living where we don't get influenced quite as strongly by those external factors that tell us that growth is the only way forward.
Oh, that's so great. Slow living as quiet living.
Yes, I love
I've
it.
heard that before, but I love it.
I'm fascinated by the term you used, the endless biggering, not bickering, biggering. And that's
Biggering.
so descriptive. Everything has to be progress, bigger and better growth. Yeah, we have to expand. Yeah. And let's just let's look at that for a minute as a whole culture. Very, very thought provoking. Thank you so much. I love that question. I feel so expanded by it every time because people have their own take on that. And it's just beautiful. Thank you.
So, Jade, what does the good dirt mean to you? The good dirt.
The good dirt to me means life. It means absolutely everything. I think it's the foundation of our gut biome, which is the foundation of our mental health, which is the foundation of us to be able to grow our own food or know those who grow our own food. It's the ability to connect to, mycorrhizal networks that are magical and beyond the human. So it actually means everything to me. It truly is the foundation of our very existence, and without it, we can provide lab solutions to feed us and to, keep us medicine rich, but actually that's all reliant on things that we need to pull out of the ground as well. Everything comes down to the dirt that we stand on and that we grow our food in. It gives us food sovereignty, it gives us medicine sovereignty, it gives us, a sense of seasonal rhythm. It gives us a sense of deeply embedded place and belonging. It's kind of everything.
Absolutely.
Amen.
Yes. So, as we begin to wrap it up here, is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Anything at all that from your farm or your book or your podcast? And then what would you like to leave our audience with?
I would like to talking about the importance of ritual. And ritual is so much more than habit. It's intentional actions that are undertaken either on your own or with those around you, but usually reflective of the greater natural world that is around us. And I think if we think about the millennia that humankind has been on the ground, ritual is what held us through the thick and the thin, through the abundant and the not so abundant times. It marked like really obnoxious exclamation marks on the ground as the year rolled through. And very slowly through the industrial age, we have actively replaced that, or maybe not actively, maybe we have done that subconsciously where it's just sort of washed over us and we've let it happen. But we've replaced the riches and the importance of ritual with consumption, really. But it's empty. It doesn't have meaning and it doesn't have value and it doesn't have the ability to connect us to the things that we need to be deeply connected with. Instead, we have all these abstractions in the way that mean that we can't truly return to who we are as humans. And I think ritual is something that all of us can do in very simple ways. It might be the first thing you do in the morning is to choose a special cup of tea and choose some special dehydrated leaves that have come from a friend or from your own garden or wherever and have a cup of tea. It might be that simple. I mean, it might also be a full moon gathering. It might be a turning of the season potluck dinner with your community. Whatever it is, I think ritual is something that is no longer held and valued in our communities, in our Western world, and I think it's a massive gap in our opportunity to rebuild culture. And then if I was to sign out, I would sign out by saying every one of us has the ability to live like tomorrow matters in order to create a steady future through the way in which we make our decisions. And the simplest place to begin is by observing and really looking around and taking our surroundings in and understanding what our role in everyday actions are.
So, all right. So I enjoyed this so much. I love the conversation. And I want to thank you so much for spending your time with us today from across the world. It's such a miracle and so fun. So thank you so much. Jade, thanks for being with us.
Yeah. Let's also have you say really quickly where people can find you if they want to learn more and follow along.
Good-o. Okay, well, we are on Instagram and Facebook, and we have websites for both Futuresteading and Black Barn Farm, and also Sustainable Table. So it's sustainabletable.org.au, it's blackbarnfarm.com.au, and it's futuresteading.com.au. And then all of those things are also on Instagram and Facebook.
Okay.
Amazing.
And your podcast, how can we find your podcast?
On any place that podcasts are. So we go through Buzzsprout and they then push it out to Apple, to Spotify, to all of the good podcast locations. And it's just called Futuresteading.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Can't wait to listen.
We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's always lovely to chat with like-minded souls.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in, calling in, and spreading the good dirt. You can reach our listener voicemail at 443-459-1950. That's 443-459-1950. You can find this number in our show notes and in the link in our Instagram profile.
This show is produced by Lady Farmer with original music composed and performed by John Kingsley. Our technical partner for this series is Citizen Racecar. Post-production by Alex Brower and Jose Miguel Baez, coordinated by Gabriela Montequin.
For more from Lady Farmer, follow us on Instagram at We Are Lady Farmer. That's We Are Lady Farmer. Or join us online at www.ladyfarmer.com. We'll see you next time on The Good Dirt.